So I mean, I guess last week was more of a discussion than anything else for the people that weren't here. We did I thought a fairly decent analysis to a degree, and then a long discussion about the Benjamin Adorno conflict over what is a dialectic of aesthetics and how does the dialectic work in terms of analyzing, particularly Baudelaire's poetry was the object, but Adorno had some questions about that. And I think, yeah, we had, if I remember correctly, we had a pretty good discussion about the novel as a form, whether it still has, existence, so to speak, as a form in our era, and there was some good discussions about that. Trying to find the page that was on where he talked about his thing with Benjamin and.
88, 91.
Yeah, okay, yeah, that's right. Yeah.
What lecture?
This was lecture 9 on the 24th of June, exactly, almost 60 years ago. And we're still hashing over the same problems. And we're still hashing over the same problems in aesthetics.
8.
Yeah.
About 8 pages.
That means we haven't had thinkers that have overcome the
No.
Thanks.
I mean, maybe we could begin with, were there any thoughts about this from last week, or where we could go with this? Because we are going to offer a course on Marxism and poetry next semester with Nikos Alexos, yeah, it should be good because he's going to, it's a kind of good way to approach this topic. I don't know if he's going to go in through the Adornian, Benjaminian. He'll probably begin with Christopher Caldwell's book on poetry, on Marxism and poetry, and proceed from there, which is a kind of orthodox reading of the poetic tradition. Do you know the book?
No, I know Jameson's Marxism in Form.
Marxism in Form is not really about poetry. It's about the novel. It's a form, yes, right. And it's about form. It's about form in literature. That's right. Yeah. I mean, if you want to extend this out and think about this, I mean, at least within the Marxian tradition, Jameson's introduction to the political unconscious is certainly worth reading on interpretation. It's about 95-page meditation on how one would do a Marxist hermeneutic approach, Marxist hermeneutical dialectical approach to literature, and how one would read, through both periodization, epoch, and form within those epochs. So that's a very, very good starting point. Marxism in Form he wrote in 72, 73, and it was the Prison House of Language and Marxism in Form were intended as one book, but the publishers divided it into two. They would not publish it as one book. So one attempt was about Russian formalism and French structuralism and beyond, which is the Prison House of Language, and then Marxism in Form took on seminal figures in the history of Marxist, thinking, including beginning with Lukács, Ernst Bloch, Benjamin, Adorno, and I think one other. Is it Brecht? Brecht? I think it was Brecht.
I was trying to think of Marxist poets.
As poets? Well, Neruda,
Marxist
of course.
Poets.
Mayakovsky.
Mayakovsky.
Yeah, Mayakovsky.
Yes, one was the great.
Maybe?
Evtushenko, right.
Neruda certainly.
Neruda certainly, yes.
The greatest poems.
Yes.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
There's one in like every country. It seems like there's the great Turkish poet.
Philip Levine, yeah.
Ahmed.
Although he was never a avowed Marxist, Philip Levine. Yeah, what work is. Names of the Lost is a very beautiful poem. But anyway, but any thoughts about this? Because really what Adorno is really trying to say is what Benjamin loses a sense of, I think, is the social totality, and that it only deals with some particular, in some ways almost authorial intention. And even though it's filled with insights, he still loses the sense of the greater whole, which, Adorno will criticize as a more idealistic, attempt by Benjamin to understand poetry and understand especially Baudelaire's poem on wine and the wine tax, whereas Adorno is trying to privilege himself as the thinker of the materialist aesthetics in this case. And I guess he's, in some ways criticizing Benjamin for being, too Kantian in some ways, that he's still dealing with these kind of, particulars without going to the, the social totality or without the totality.
Focusing on the wine tax.
On the wine tax itself, right, instead of, going further into why does this form reach a certain kind of limit at this point. And,
It's not idealist, though.
Well, it is in some ways. We're not asking, because he's only looking at small little parts. He's not looking at the materialist whole. Yeah. It loses movement. Yes. Oh, sorry.
So I wouldn't ask this question except that later on, and I can't remember if it was 12 or 13, Adorno accedes and provides some examples of empirical social research that he then critiques with a view to the particular and the totality. So I wasn't here last week, but I did listen to the tape. And you and Stanley talked about, I think you used the term positivism of the left. And Stanley used the example of Amy Goodman's show.
That was a pretty good example, actually.
Yeah, so
I mean, in some ways, please,
Because Adorno allowed for some examples, I want to ask if you could perhaps elucidate this concept of the totality through an example, for instance, of this Me Too movement going on now. So on the one hand, you've got Amy Goodman, who talks about
You're very provocative, especially to someone like me, but it's okay.
She talks about it as sort of this moment of
every
great
other day,
resistance,
right?
Which is very historically important, but she doesn't situate it in anything. Okay, and then you have someone like Rick Wolff, who talks about it on his program in a much broader context.
You mean Harriet? I'm sorry. I'm just trying to be specific to the particular.
I wasn't. I'm being recorded, so I don't want.
Oh, okay. I'm going to have dinner with him anyway, but I was part of the discussion that broadened it. I promise you. He doesn't watch this. They don't watch this. But please, Beth, I'm sorry to interrupt.
There's so much there that's confusing.
Yes.
But anyway, right. And so then he situates it, this Me Too moment, in a broader context, which is the labor movement. And he says, of course, everything would be solved if we had worker-owned cooperatives. We wouldn't have this issue.
That's positivism, too.
So that's what I wanted you to critique. Like, this is Amy Goodman, and this is Rick Wolff going farther. But I think it's probably both examples of positivism of the left.
Right.
And then how would you interrogate that issue if you were looking at it dialectically? Got a bit of a notion there.
Yeah, it's a very large,
Okay.
But it's okay. I mean, we could try to kind of openly discuss it. I just want to preface this by saying, the Republicans are much smarter than the Democrats. I want to say that. If you look at Trump going to Florida, he didn't go to Alabama directly. He went to Alabama, but the real talk was in Florida. Why does he go to northern Florida? Because everybody's got a cousin in Alabama that they're going to call and get out the vote for Roy Moore. And, the odds right now is that Roy Moore will be a member of the U.S. Senate. And I'm willing to bet that, I hope I'm wrong about this, but the way I'm seeing it is Mitch McConnell will say, the people have spoken. They're not going to go after Moore when he gets to the House. Yeah. So, and another, right. And this is the thing. We've got a Republican in. We're going to lose a majority. There's another election. Et cetera, et cetera. So with that said, going back, it seems to me that what's happening here empirically is that you're having all these kind of facts. This is what positivism deals with. It's always, what were the facts in the case, always, right? And what positivism does, at least in its most banal form, is only these are the facts and there's nothing else, going on, right? It's in some cases, in the worst case of positivism, it's devoid of the historical context. Now, Benjamin is not doing that. He's still staying within a historical context. He's not moving from the outside. But given the way most of this Me Too movement is coming out, it's really about, facts from the past, right? And most of the analysis on the good days, say a Rick Wolff or other people, may begin to look at this through a historical cultural moment of where everything was permitted, if you want to use that kind of slogan, of the 60s and the 70s, right? In a sense, that this was, this was kind of like a thing of male prerogative in a context, right? In these contexts of, power and power relations, which of course were
Somebody's saying that?
Nobody's really saying that.
Oh,
yeah,
okay.
yeah. No, I've been thinking about this. That the context. No, nobody's really. I think nobody's really drawn the kind of thing.
Put it in
in that kind of
exactly
context.
in that context.
She does. Okay.
Yes, she does.
As male prerogative.
Yes,
right.
Absolutely.
Okay.
But was it?
That's
and
one.
she traces the social relations as they changed also, in the context of capitalism.
So, but then the question would be, is she only thinking this is about capitalism? Because this has happened as well in many other forms. This is part of the problem. If you know anything about Victor Beria, if you know anything about, what went on in other countries and what has happened in many, many other forms of government, this is not so specific to capitalism.
I
didn't hear the program. I better go home and listen. Yeah.
His right to have the first night. That's what the marriage of Figaro.
Well, this is in the myths of the Greeks. The prerogative of the gods. The anthropomorph-centric the gods. Zeus picks who he likes, even Hera. It's not specific to gender even in the ancient Greeks.
She wasn't situated
I'm sorry.
in capitalism.
No?
Target wasn't. No, she was basically saying it was a backlash to the feminist movement, and that this ownership that the men felt over women then kind of went underground in a sense, because they couldn't have this male dominance as they did in the 60s and 70s, but they still had this desire to do this, and so they were doing it in these inappropriate ways, basically. Well, how she was saying it. I was surprised she didn't situate it within capitalism on Rick's show.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I didn't hear it, so I don't know.
He pushed her into saying, well, this will all be solved in the
He did say that? And will the workers' co-op will do that? Oh boy, yeah. I better keep wearing black,
It was almost a non sequitur.
Exactly.
It's almost what? I'm sorry?
Almost a non sequitur. It went took a right angle.
Yeah.
He said, well, but this would all be solved if we had worker-owned co-ops. And she went, well, okay.
But it's an interesting deflection because, it doesn't say anything about desire. Like, what do we do about desire? Like, if you desire someone,
see,
reach a puritanical state
that's
where
the social
people are not gonna
totality.
talk about desire at all.
Yeah.
Well, I thought that how she spoke about desire, I just heard that one program. I just thought she wasn't taking into consideration the capitalism, libidinal grasp it has over all of us.
Are you saying she hasn't read Lyotard's?
That she hasn't read. That I know for a fact. I know for a fact.
I thought that was kind of...
Yeah, but going back to this question of the positivism would never raise the question of desire as a social totality, and beginning with that as a movement, really, in a sense, is this a movement in the dialectic. And Adorno doesn't talk about it so much here, but his colleague, Marcuse talks about desire in Eros and Civilization, as do, the French especially, after, as a movement in Hegel, that it's really desire, death, repetition that's really working out, and this is part and parcel, not something so gender specific, even though the sexual difference is talked about actively, but it's really the question of desire, and that this is much more of a an embracing concept that's moving things always. This is what. Yeah. Yes, he does. Yes, desire in machines, and which is an attempt to break down patriarchal, and capitalist relations. Yeah, yeah. I mean, they consider Freud part of the imperial signifier in that work. You know, the first thinker of desire. So in a way, I mean, you know, it seems to me that nobody really talks about that way. See, you have to ask the question, at least to my mind, and I'm not, you know, condoning any of this behavior, but why is it that an Isaiah Argento, you know, will keep going back to Weinstein? What is that desire that's playing out? This is a provocative question, you know, in a sense. Does she really need that much? What is playing out at the level of, you know, perversity and all these things? So the psychoanalytic dimension, to me, seems to be left out of all of this, you know, and left out as a real working model. Instead, it's, again, the positivism of the facts, etc. I would address the problem through what does, you know, if you want to talk about capitalism, what are these perversities that are produced by, you know, the capitalist desiring machine that we're all prone to, that we're all part of the effects of, you know? And in a way, it's an ongoing affect of everyday life. I'm not saying I have any answers to this, but it just seems to me that the problematic is brought out that, you know, everybody's had an encounter like this, you know? I mean, look, I went 1 year to Choate School. It's known, you know, you were a chody, right? You know, I had professors coming on to me like, you know, Craig, I mean, you know, I just took it and, you know, this was known at the school. You know, nobody really made a big deal of it. This was in the 60s, you know, in a sense. So it's not, you know, it's not so, again, it becomes part of this kind of moment where we really don't want to dig deep and say, like a Dostoevsky, we mentioned last week as a very great pathologist, or a Nietzschean genealogy of this. It's much easier to say, this happened to me too. You know, who's that lawyer you're using? You know, let's put it out there in the media all the time and every day. It literally takes up, I've watched this on MSNBC, it takes up, of the 5 hours of airtime, at least 3 hours a night on a continual basis, 60%. Not that I'm sitting there, but I can see by the guests, you know, I just mute it and, you know, do other things.
So is
but,
Rachel
you know,
Maddow off Russia now? Is she all about...
She's on Russia and Me Too.
Oh.
Russia and Me Too. And I'm sure President Putin's going to come up as a, you know, a harasser too.
Maybe
I mean,
she'll
combine the two together. Exactly.
Well, President Putin said he was confronted by a conservative Russian senator, who said that they need to change the family laws in Russia to, because there are Soviet laws or whatever still, and define it as a religious holy like marriage. And Putin quoted Engels and Marx from memory, and in a live press conference saying that there is no proof that monogamy is virtuous.
Right. It goes back to the Engels position that we're polygamous by, you know.
And he further made the interesting distinction, which I was surprised about, where he said later on Soviet society became more patriarchal, whereas he said in the first 10 years, he said the Marxist intelligentsia was really rooted in like the study of Marx and Engels on the question of the family. Yeah. So he says later on Soviet like family life, which became more conservative, and part of the party sort of started adjudicating divorce disputes, and he said that we should differentiate that too. You know, so people got confused, like, what is he trying to say? Like, you know.
So a bit of the Bolshevik past lives in the ex-KGB operative here as
that
president.
would be unthinkable.
The American talks about that too, the fragments from the past.
Yes, that's right.
Which then come into contradiction.
Yeah, right. So in other words, I guess where we're trying to go here with the Adornian thing, since you bring up the kind of fragments of the past, is this fractured dialectic. You know, this is not a coherent, consistent dialectic that Adorno's talking about. It's always a fracture, right? But always related to the whole, right? To a much greater thing, and all these particulars from Me Too to whether Roy Moore would get elected to the Russia Gate or whatever we want to call these things is all, you know, just parts of things that can be used by the positivist, you know, tradition, you know, in terms of at least the social effects of the positivist position. The positivism that he talks about is much more complex philosophically, because he puts Descartes, if you read chapters, you know, 12 and 13 up through 15, I mean, lectures 12, 13, and 15, you begin to see that there's much more complexity involved here in terms of scientific method, you know. I mean, we're talking right now about positivism in terms of how it's used by media in terms of dissemination of facts, and that it's never really a dialectical construction, you know, in this way. Yeah. I mean, it's interesting. Jack Nicholson's name hasn't come up. You know, I mean, you know, they're all. You know how many stories there are out there. I mean, you know, some of us in this room. What's that? What happened?
All the NPR people.
All the NPR people. That's
Yeah,
another.
I see.
It goes to show you about this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
My brother is so upset about Lenny Lopez. He's like,
Oh, I can tell you stories. I'll give you some more ammunition.
I mean, literally, he sent me all the comments in support of Lopez from the website. He said,
Listen,
see,
I'll demystify Lenny Lopez.
And
6 years ago, 8 years ago, I get a call at 8 o'clock in the evening from a woman who was recommended to me by a friend to give her a crash course in Hannah Arendt, Julia Kristeva, Simone Weil, and supposedly Colette. Well, I don't know much about Colette, but I knew a lot about Arendt and Kristeva especially, and you know, something about Simone Weil. This was for Leonard Lopez, to the background for the show the next day because he was having Julia Kristeva on. I was up till 5 in the morning. You know, I got a very nice bottle of wine out of it, and a few bottles. But
who
anyway,
did the information?
Leonard Lopez.
Someone from the
She
show.
worked, so she worked for Lopez,
She
the
worked for
researcher,
Lopez,
right?
yeah.
Everything, and I listened to the radio the
just
next day.
reads his
Well, it's
shit.
good to hear
He
my
just
voice
reads
on Leonard Lopez. Right. So anyway, tell your brother he's, you know, not only so to hide things is part of his, you know, business.
Yeah,
That's how he operates.
yeah.
But yeah, anyway. But yeah, you're going to say something? I mean,
Oh,
about
no,
this
no, I was just
positive?
laughing.
Yeah, about the positive. Yeah. No, I'm sorry.
Lopez.
The Lopez, yeah. So I don't know. I mean, I don't know really ultimately how to, respond to this. But I think this, in some ways, you know, creates more of the, you know, Civil War divide that's going on in this country right now. I mean, this is something that the right will take up as a very reactionary formation that they will use politically much more effectively than the Amy Goodman to the liberal left and the, you know, the so-called liberal center in Congress. This is at least my initial take on it. I really hope I'm wrong, but it will be used
Meaning
politically
reaction
more
formation.
effective. Yeah, it's a reaction formation. Yes, absolutely. Yeah, go
I
ahead.
mean, what's the next step in this like process? You know, the total. I mean, without considering the totality, right, of these issues on the
Right.
question of gender and sort of.
Right.
The final result is what? Like, there's just going to be no meaningful communication at all in public places. Public from the liberal point of view, like places at work, there'll be sort of no. It's literally going to change the language. I mean, it won't avoid the sexual abuse. It'll just become more hidden, but it'll change the talk of everyday life. It'll totally transform the way. I mean, and if this became sort of a new sort of hegemonic mode of behavior in the office, this will completely change and redraw the way people even speak. No, like
Much worse than Habermas.
yeah, exactly. Like
Much worse than Habermas,
you know?
Peter.
Yeah.
Habermas looks like a raving, you know, militant at this point.
I mean, that's where we're going.
Yeah,
It's
yeah, in some
dysfunctional,
ways.
even
Yes.
more dysfunctional.
Right, more
It's
dysfunctional.
already fucked up.
Yeah, it's already fine. I'm well aware.
No, but at least
Yeah,
you can
I'm not-
at least you can
yeah.
maintain
Yeah, yeah.
communication, but
Yeah.
the communication might interrupt.
Okay, you want to differ? Yeah,
Yeah,
sure.
I mean, look, I worked for 45 years at McGraw-Hill. I cannot remember seeing anything or hearing about anything that, you know, would be questioned on this whole, you know, thing. I don't see how all of this would affect the relations dialogue that already went on there. You know, I'm sure there's a lot that I didn't see, but at least, you know, in terms of my experiences, you know, I didn't experience.
Well, I mean,
There's abuse certainly, but not, you know, the kind of sexual sort of stuff we're talking.
yeah, I mean, yeah, Phil, yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah,
I mean, I think
Right.
people. I think it's systemic in that it's how people respond to abuse. You know, I mean, the system abuses people, and you know, and abuse is how people are dealt with on a day-to-day basis in their working lives, and. You know, so on one side you have the right wing saying, fuck it, you know, sexual abuse, yeah, suck it up, you know. And on the other side, you know, is like, okay, well, we can't have sexual abuse, and we're gonna draw these. We're gonna delineate these lines. You know that. Okay, here's this, and then you know it's. I think.
That's very Cartesian, what you're describing, going back to the lesson in a certain way, that you would demarcate space, that you would begin to delimit these things.
Solution.
It's a very positive.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm just saying the way it's framed, going back to the text. I think. I mean, you know, I think, you know, that's you know.
No, without actually looking at the power relationships and how you get rid of those power relationships.
Right.
But you can't get rid of the power.
Yeah, you can't. I mean, that's the thing.
No.
You can't get rid of the power, nor is there, as I think there is a presupposition, a kind of transparency of language. So, you know, I mean, I've had to sit through these sexual training sessions in the university, where it's everything.
They've never invited
me. You know, consent. You know, so if two students have a relationship before, you know, there has to be. Do you agree, you know, that I can do this, and the other person says yes, and so on down the line. And obviously that's not all, I mean, we can't, things are not always that transparent, and can be even verbal, and maybe, who knows what, you know, the deeper meanings are, but there at least you don't have liability. You say, I've done my due diligence. I asked the question, and they said yes, but I guess you have to record it too, because, I mean, but there's a certain legalism. I mean, if anything, I mean, Ardo is right, in the sense it's a legalistic recoding of communication, that everything has to be done in a certain way so as to preclude
Since you came in, this discussion began because Beth was interested in actually watching about the Me Too movement as maybe a form of positivism, or listening last week. Stanley and I had the discussion about all of us really had the discussion about positivism and vis-a-vis Amy Goodman's reportage, the way the media is handling certain things. So this is where this is coming from in terms of a social effect. Yeah, what is the empirical moment here versus that of the if you will, the theoretical or the greater social totality? And yeah, this is where the discussion began. Yeah. So yeah, but I mean, I agree. The institutions are like police. This is part of the problem, that you've gotten into this policing aspect of the institution, which really blocks creativity, I think, which really happened, You cannot go in and there's a problem in the classroom. If some of you probably know about this, in certain places, certainly not where I work, and I don't know about BMCC or other places, but at certain places there are trigger words that students, have to complain. Where does this come from? This isn't education. This isn't growth. Etc. And as Bernard Stiegler says, part of the problem is this prolonged dependency that parents are becoming friends with their kids all the time. This is part of the problem. This actually fosters more and more this new desire called capitalism and what's going on. It also has a material location because nobody can afford to leave home anymore, in terms of the paying rent in certain cities. But anyway, this, again, very, very important to kind of take into consideration, and again, not discussed. But yeah, I mean, Amy Goodman, I think he used the example of Amy Goodman, last time as a way of saying that all we're doing is we're thematizing around facts. We're only thematizing, and it's the consistent and same group of themes all the time, and it's always about, I think Stanley said this, or I'll say it if he didn't, it's always about the politics of victimhood. It's always the politics of the victim. It's not the overcoming of something. It's not the, the
Me Too.
It's always Me Too. Yeah, think about the language, from Black Lives Matter to Me Too. This is, in some ways, it's kind of these codes that are set up, at least to my mind. Again, I may be wrong, but, at least to my mind, the codes that are being set up are really a new kind of politics of the victimhood, instead of a politics that tries to overcome and be creative and move forward in a different direction. What that shape that would take is another question for real discussion. But, you know, it seems to me we're living in a period on the left, and I don't know if, you know, Stanley would agree or other people in the room, but it seems to me that the left has become, you know, we are justice. You know, this is the announcement, the pronouncement. And we're here to get the accounting, and we're going to make it right. And that's it. That's the level of the consciousness at this point. And, you know, we get Rick with, you know, the workers' cooperatives, or we get, you know, occasionally some other things. You know, there's always this, you know, let's look at the great things that are happening in South America at certain points, you know, or we see little pockets of resistance, you know. But this is it. I mean, this is a problem.
Well, Rick is not the liberal left. Rick is a Marxist.
I know that. Yeah. Well, I mean, I was using the left in a broad sense. I didn't. Yeah. Liberal left is you know, that's the most bad faith out there today.
Well, the Democrats have gone so far as to suggest that if Moore gets elected, it'll be great for them because they'll be able to point to the moral ineptitude of the Republican Party.
They should go spend some time in Alabama.
And rooted out their people right away when they got tried to accuse them of.
It's another massive misreading.
That worked well with
Massive misreading.
Yeah.
Worked well with Trump.
Yeah.
Worked well with Trump, yeah. In the election of 2016, yeah. Just a year ago.
That's all they got.
13 months, we still haven't learned any lessons.
No, and we're just digging deeper.
Right.
But I think psychology has something to do with this.
We were talking about desire when you first
The notion,
came in.
not only desire, but
Yeah.
the notion that people are fragile and they need to be protected,
Right.
that people are not capable of enduring.
Well, people do need to be protected, and you know, we are kind of fragile. But on the other hand, it's a question of who is doing the protecting, and you know, what are the conditions of that protection is kind of the point. You know, yeah. And the interesting thing is, you know, there are very, very few people of the you know, for lack of a better term, the lower working class, the lower proletariat, or whatever, you know, or the you know, the black Hispanic culture that works in retail every day, etc., that are really talking about this again. You know, it's just like what, you know, black women used to say about white feminism. You know.
Well, Time put one on their cover.
Yeah, that's good. They had the token.
Yeah.
Okay.
And they're talking about like
Hotel
migrant workers. And
Workers, DSK, what was his name?
Dominique Strauss-Kahn. He almost became premier of France. He would have been before Trump.
Yes.
Yeah.
He attacked that hotel worker.
Yes.
Yeah.
Made it an awful movie. Gerard
Terrible movie.
Depardieu played the thing. Terrible.
Terrible.
It's like, you know, an advertisement at Trump Tower for, you know. Yeah, terrible movie. Yeah. And Depardieu was, you know, in the process of moving to Russia during that period too, like to evade taxes. Yes. Right.
My friend Ian Parker wrote a book on this.
Who's this?
Ian Parker.
Oh yeah, Ian Parker. Yeah.
He wrote a nice book on this idea of psychology and the idea of people being fragile and needing protection.
Yeah.
I forget the title of the book.
We reviewed it in Situations. He wrote a piece for us based on that book.
We did.
Yeah, about 10 years ago. Yeah. Something about radical psychology or radical, something along those lines. So, yeah, please. Yeah, I'm sorry. I mean, I'm trying to, work with this. I mean, empirical, you know, to kind of go beyond this whole empirical, I mean, you know.
It is a little bit off the Me Too thing.
Yeah, sorry.
There's a Monthly Reviews republished this thing by Doug Dowd about how Marxists have lost touch with common people and with the working class, and have just kind of gone off into the kind of academic examinations that nobody can really, that people at a base level, you know, working people just don't understand anymore. You know, and you know, points out how much things have changed since the early, well, he was writing this in 1980, and so how much things have changed, you know, from the early 20th century when the people who were you know, leading the discussion on this stuff were working class people. And, you know, the late 20th century, really,
well, yeah, I mean, what we've witnessed the last, I think, since the 60s or really maybe early 70s is this kind of retreat into academic Marxism in the worst sense, you know, and you know, what has been referred to as the Marxism of the chair. You know, instead of armchair, the Marxism of the chair, because of the departments and, you know, chairs of departments have been Marxist, etc. So it becomes much more of an academic exercise rather than a practice, you know, in a sense, and this kind of movement away from Gramsci and stuff. And I mean, you know, you can do scholastic reading of this forever, but, you know, again, what is this as a weapon? I like what Deleuze so used to says, neither hope nor fear, I'm always looking for new weapons. Right, and that to me seems to be a very good battle cry. You know, neither hope nor fear, nor the principle of hope, nor should we be living in fear. You know, and you know, or living in this fear, and we should always be searching for new weapons. And you know, what kind of weapon is this? You know, in a sense, and
And how do you apply it?
Yeah. Well, yeah, how do you orient thinking first, you know, towards how do you rethink things to this point so you're not always trapped in this kind of positivistic, you know, thing. Empirically, this happened, right, all the time. This has happened, right, in a sense. That's not especially, you know, a theoretical moment, right, or a thinking moment, for at least for, you know.
I think it was like Heidegger who said that, among other things, that thinking comes before interpretation. So, you know, you can't really interpret anything if you don't really know anything. So that's the fundamental problem that we have today, that the thinking has been interrupted, you know, within the left, or our connection to praxis. And we interpret a lot based on a certain, but if you don't have any basis of thinking, then you can't. Right?
So for someone like Adorno, I mean, just because I know he's always gotten the bad, you know, Adorno lives in the Grand Hotel Abyss, from Lukács to, you know, you can't penetrate this. Where is this guy coming from? You know, he's thinking in multiple paragraphs at once, and, you know, you can't read them. But for Adorno, this is a praxis, thinking and writing as praxis. He finds this to be that, so that thought can't be co-opted, brought back in. That Madison Avenue can't, you know, use this, you know, these, look, they probably could do it in a banal form, but, you know, this is part of the, part of what he's really trying to do. One of the reasons he's writing this way and why he's privileging, in my view, the negative dialectic. You know, he's really trying to do this. He does not want a reconciliatory dialectic. This is part of the problem Adorno with other Marxists, in a sense, is that Adorno believes, you know, and actually is working with the presupposition that, you know, that there is ultimately not a reconciliation, that the principle of contradiction, you know, and the force of the dialectic is much more open-ended and cannot be closed at the end. Yeah. So this
is the negation much more important than the resolution of the contradiction.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. So, you know, so the little piece we read of Marcuse on negative thinking, I think, is, you know, there, even though it's a little, you know, it's much more down, if you will, than the reading through this all the time. But remember, these are 20 lectures given to graduate students. They're probably about an hour and a half lecture. You know, in Germany, I don't think they do this anymore, but, you know, they sit there, they lecture for for an hour and 45 minutes, and that's it. You know, and as I mentioned last week with Gerbich, like at the New School, no questions, ladies and gentlemen. Right? You know, he used to say, there will be no questions, right? Yeah, he was good. No, it's good at that. Yeah. So this is what this is intended as, is a series of lectures, both historically, but also the movement of thought. And that's why I turned, you know, the last time that Stanley wasn't here, why I thought it would be a good idea to look at the general trajectory, the plan of the lectures, you know, the outline of what dialectics is, you know, and et cetera. But I think this is these lectures 10 through 15, especially 12, 13, and 15, are crucial for what he's doing, you know, in terms of the relationship to positivism. I think the attempt to situate Descartes, and remember, positivism for Adorno is part of dialectical thinking. It's not oppositional. You know, it's not only an antagonistic, right? And he has a great saying about the discourse on method of Descartes. We can't just dispense with it, and there's so many people that do this. You know, I mean, that they say, oh, you don't want to read that, you know, that's archaic, it's not dialectical, etc. He's saying you have to show dialectically where the clear and distinct doctrine is not operative at a certain level. You've got to show how it's not working, you know. So that's why I think he goes through, you know, the principles of the discoursive method, you know. And for those of you in the Heidegger's class, the rules for the direction of mind, that, you know, he engages in the worldhood of a world and in the questions of space. Yeah, Beth. Yeah.
He's got this great
He's
got this great, very snide statement on page 119.
What lecture?
Sorry, lecture 12.
Thank you.
And it's 1, 2, 3, 4th paging. And he says, I would say that dialectical thought is always involved in something like an intellectual form of atomic fission.
Yes.
Like, it's explosive.
Yes.
Although I would certainly not claim anything like the celebrated status of the modern natural science for the efforts and exertions of dialectic, which, as we know, has no such brilliant results to show as the creation of the atomic bomb.
Right.
I just thought
it's a very good section, by the way.
I could almost see him delivering that, just like boom.
Right.
But also at the very top
1958 too.
Yeah. At the top of that page in 119, he says about thinking, where he says at the very top of 119, he says where human beings capitulate before the so-called givens. Without displaying that very mistrust which, from the perspective of conventional consciousness, of the mere acceptance of the world as it initially presents itself, cannot fail to create the impression of something artificial and all too clever, which does violence to the way things are. So that's basically the critique of the way what we will call positivism today is basically the acceptance of the of just the simple given that you just
and a little,
like, oh yeah, this must be a bad person, or oh,
a little further down vis-a-vis your comments about, you know, Stanley's example of Amy Goodman and the positivism. But on the other hand, I emphatically believe, this is the middle of the page 119, from the ordinary use of the understanding precisely. The dialectical mode of thinking is distinguished from the ordinary use of the understanding precisely because it refuses to be satisfied with the givenness we have described, because it properly begins its work exactly where the given confronts us most inexorably, where dialectical thought attempts to penetrate what is opaque and seemingly impenetrable, and to bring all this into movement. Is crucial. And if I were not afraid that some of the natural sciences that you read, you know, in Artaud, and then down the page vis-a-vis positivism, at the last paragraph on 119, I said to you that the specific position of dialectic in relation to positivism already lies in the way that the givens, which furnish the ultimate point of reference for the positivist view, right, and which standard positivist epistemology typically describes as the immediately given, which is a Hegelian thing too, right, that goes on in the phenomenology, which is, you know, pre-dialectical, are recognized for their part as something which is mediated, right? In other words, dialectical thought shows that the ultimate point of reference to which our claim to knowledge appeals as a solid and secure position is not an ultimate point at all, right? But something that generally presupposes in turn what it purports to produce from itself. And I have tried to develop this thought in an emphatic fashion in the 3rd chapter of his, and this is a great work of his knowledge theory, Metacritique of Epistemology, that he was working on from 33 to 37 when he was in England, but didn't publish until the 60s. Before negative dialectics. But this is his attempt to, you know, go, you know, really very deeply into, you know, problems with knowledge, problems with knowing, epistemological problems. And would draw your attention to the discussion here. You will find a detailed attempt to show their interconnection, the particular categories which are called the theory of knowledge, which are supposed to constitute the subjective world in the first place, as this is understood by the traditional epistemological projects for their part, presuppose that same objective word, namely existence in space and time, just as no existence in space and time can be thought in turn without these categories. I cannot present these reflections properly in the context, etc. But let's go down the page. Since the concept of dialectic, both in Hegel's phenomenology and the work of Marx, is indeed essentially a social content. And this is an argument both against Husserl and Heidegger, you know, that he's going through here. That it's a social content, since I know many of you are particularly interested in questions social sciences. I believe it is particularly fitted I take examples from this domain. Forgive me again if I use examples. You know, he goes through this again, right? And from this domain, and I should not really do so, but it's a hard life being a dialectician, and specifically from the positivistic side of the social sciences, and in part for what is known as empirical social research, insofar as this aims to gather information about the opinions and forms of behaviors of individuals and even of statistically defined social groups. For those of you that don't know, I mean, I think some of you really know a lot about this, is that Adorno was part of the Princeton radio project under the guidance of Paul Lazarsfeld, in which they did empirical studies, you know, throughout. So the Frankfurt School did engage in empirical studies, including what they called the F scale, which would measure levels of fascism, and the, you know, it should be re-articulated today since we don't have anything close to that. But anyway, they did engage in this kind of work.
What did they study in these empirical studies?
Well, the empirical studies were how people received the Texaco hour of music, you know, and in terms of principles of selection, what would be put on the radio programs on Saturday afternoons, audience reception, audience you know, participation, all these kind of things. And they would try to look at this, you know, and Adorno is developing his theory of serious music versus, you know, non-serious music, which was everything else besides Mahler, Beethoven, Bach, Schoenberg, Berg, and Webern.
He makes reference to that here. He says,
he does? Okay, yeah.
He says when you do studies, the hit music that people like most turn out just to be the ones that are played more.
The ones they're familiar with.
Familiar with, yes,
yeah,
right.
Familiar
with, yeah. Yeah, he went through these. What's that? I'm sorry?
The problem of cause and effect. I mean,
yes.
Because people like it, it's played more.
For them, it was not really cause and effect, it's really effects. You know, that's what they're really studying, is effects of the way these programs had upon the audience, right? Yeah.
This was about the time that payola stuff came.
Yes, payola was right after that. Yes, that's right. Yeah.
What's payola?
Yeah, the Texaco.
I didn't think about that.
Payola is where they would pay you to play. You're the disc jockey. I'll pay you to play this song a certain amount of time, and that sells.
I got this guy named Ray Charles, man. You got to hear this. How much is we going to pay for that? Yeah.
Now it's pop farms.
Yes, that's right. Yeah. So anyway, this is a very good section about what, you know, we've been talking about in terms of, you know, what he sees as you know, the method of the understanding, etc.
The discussion of the family in chapter 14 was really interesting.
Yeah, we can go there. Yeah, sure. Yeah. Like I said, I was informed at 10:30, so it's on all of us today. Descartes and Marx shared one thing in common. They both didn't like to get out of bed until noon. They both were very late thinkers and, you know, very late risers too. Descartes' sleeping habits were changed by Queen Christina of Sweden, and she made him get up at 6 o'clock in the morning to go give her lessons in metaphysics, and he caught pneumonia and died. You know? Probably his, you know, yeah, true story. Yeah. Go to give her lessons in the morning in metaphysics, right? Yeah. What page on the?
Well, actually, preceding that, it's really interesting.
Yeah.
On page 144, where he talks about the development of National Socialism, And it made me think of the Trump election, and he talks about notions of blood and earth, and people who seek salvation in the past and whose consciousness is turned backwards to earlier phases of development. This regressive tendency is really interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Really seem to pertain to our moment as well.
This is about the cult of origins, right? I mean, you know, that, yeah, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But, and he talks about how when you get these fragments of the past that appear to be regressive, they're not actually discontinuous.
Right, right.
I actually wanted to ask you.
Yeah, sure.
Especially in this passage, I was wondering what his Adorno's notion of progress was.
No such thing.
No such things.
It's very Nietzschean in that respect, I think.
But do you think he has a different definition for development versus progress in this passage, or do you think it both?
In this passage here,
Yeah.
you mean? Yeah, I mean for Horkheimer, for the Frankfurt School, it was really the utopia to come, you know. And Adorno was, I guess, the most pessimistic, and certainly the most Nietzschean about this. That he didn't really think there's such thing as progress as an idea as it had been articulated. They may have come up with something different in a way later, but you know, there was not anything about the progress as such as we understand it. You know, I mean, you could say part of the dialectical method, going back to Lefebvre, you know, there's a progressive regressive method in Lefebvre in which you have vertical relations that you're reading alongside horizontal, and the regressive, you know, in some ways is part of the vertical movement and interrelations, of which, you know, Jean-Paul Sartre does a very good job in Search for a Method, both using and citing, and then plays it out in the Critique of Dialectical Reason, you know, which is another story. But in terms of progress, you know, I don't think the Frankfurt School, they were very pessimistic about this, you know, in a way. Again, it was the development of, you know, the mind and the human being, but not so much that you're going to really get this, you know, progressive continuum, if you will, you know, in some senses. And yeah, I mean, it's a very difficult question. Whereas you have more hope. I mean, Ernst Bloch, if you want to go to some of the other thinkers of this period who were around, Bloch was much more hopeful. He had a principle of hope. And certainly Marcuse in the 60s and 70s, although Artaud's got a great story about, you know, the Adorno-Marcuse confrontation over the students, and this, it might fit with the progress. You want to,
so Marcuse, Adorno wrote to Marcuse saying why he didn't support 1968, the student movement, and he said, these kids are building barricades against the people who are holding the bomb. You know, so in other words, we can interpret this as sort of like a pessimism of like, don't do it, which is how some Marxists have interpreted it.
Right.
But it can also be interpreted like in a Leninist fashion, like you have to be much more serious to confront the people with the bomb. You know, it requires different militancy. Like, in other words, they weren't sufficiently militant, you know, which is pretty awesome.
And you're thinking further down the line.
They weren't thinking. They were just like the most immediate. They were not. They were very positivist. They're just engaging with the facts. Build a barricade to fight the police.
Right.
But you got the people with the bomb.
Right.
Yeah. Take the city.
Better to be, remember that character, Aristotle, Socrates, Phillips was his name? Or was it John Aristotle, Socrates, Phillips, the one that built the bomb at Princeton in the 70s? You remember that? He built an atomic bomb?
Yeah.
This guy? Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Or he figured out how to.
Well, he figured out, of course, yeah. No, I mean, I know he didn't literally, you know. But yeah.
It's hard to get all the materials.
Yeah, get all the materials in one place. You got to go to Nevada and Utah and.
That was
you gotta build a factory.
Undergraduate thesis.
Yeah. Oh, building the bomb was his undergrad. That's good. Yeah, that speaks well for Princeton in advanced research. Yeah, indeed.
Did they throw him out, or he?
Oh yeah, it was he was on TV and the whole bit. Yeah.
What's wrong with doing a thesis on that?
No, I think they were worried that he wasn't actually, you know, had the capability. Classified. Classified. Became classified, Peter. Yeah. He got a taxonomy on his undergraduate work. That's a feat, you know. So, anyway, I you know, to talk.
Can't take that literally, though, right? It's not literally about the bomb.
I don't know. I mean, to me,
you think that they would, you know, use the atomic bomb on Paris because the students were barricading the streets? That's not.
No, I think he meant it in the sense that if you're going to confront the state,
yeah, possession
the
of
state today
force.
is much more militarized.
Possession of
than in
force.
1933.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
much more deeply penetrated, like in Gramsci's terms. You can't just build barricades and like espouse ideas about, you know, critique of capitalism in that trivial way and expect to overcome the capitalist state. You know, I mean, I think he meant it in that way. You know,
Yeah.
and there has to
It's
be
metaphorical. It's not meant to. It's not about the bomb as such.
no,
He
literally.
didn't mean it literally. Just like he doesn't mean it literally here when Beth
conspiracies,
was
you have to
reading.
have, you know, organizations that
humor,
are capable of, which is interesting because he doesn't really talk about that in his formal books. This kind of notion of politics as an organized struggle. And
Well, you have to remember, they were,
it's
I
between
mean,
the lines.
Adorno went back to teach at Frankfurt. Marcuse
Which
was
is-
in California, in Waltham, Massachusetts, at Brandeis for a while, and then went to San Diego, right? So you had Marcuse was in California during the student up, you know, Angela Davis, I think, graduated. You know, she was teaching at UCLA in '64, and you know was still in touch with Marcuse. And you know, you had all these, you know, moments in Southern and Northern California, obviously. So Marcuse was in touch with us, and whereas Adorno is basically giving lectures in Berlin and in Frankfurt during this period.
So that's his work.
And
he went back to denazify.
And yeah, and he went back. I mean, you know, he went back. You know, and yeah. And Marcuse stayed. And Marcuse became much more the pop figure. And nobody read Adorno in the 60s in the United States. It was a one-dimensional man, was the book. Yeah, wasn't Theodor Adorno. Adorno, interestingly enough, if you want to do a kind of analysis, a kind of empirical, positivistic, but try to broaden it into more of a social role, Adorno became read in the 80s after Reagan was elected. Adorno became you know, a kind of, you know, for lack of a better term, the aesthetic theory became a kind of cult book among, you know, philosophers and literary theorists. And, you know, and New German critique, you know, brought Adorno, and Telos brought Adorno back to the United States. You know, and they kind of forgot Marcuse, and people started to say, wow, you know, this is thinking, you know, this was a different level than one-dimensional man and Eros and civilization. So this happened in a period of you know, a kind of very reactionary period in the United States, whereas Marcuse's, you know, status was very high during you know, the countercultural movement. You know, there used to be the 3M company, Marx, Mao, and Marcuse. Right? It used to be called like the 3M company in the 60s. But yeah, he became very, very significant in the 80s and the 90s.
This
and
is the
I don't
aesthetic.
The aesthetic theory, and of course the dialectic of the Enlightenment, which is taught, you know, actively in courses. Which, in my, going back to Nori's question about progress, is a very pessimistic book. It's a very pessimistic book, you know, very, you know. And you talk about Me Too and all of that. I've said this, you know, a lot. I mean, it's an essay that I reread a lot. It's Juliet, you know, on de Sade. You know, he has he and Horkheimer thing about, you know, de Sade's aristocratic reaction to the French, you know, Revolution and notions of equality. And this is playing out very much right now, too, in the certain value systems. You know, when you said Putin cites, you know, Engels from, you know, the origin of, you know, private property, the family, private property in the state, you know, that you know, we're not, you know, quote, monogamous, you know, and, you know, by nature, etc. I mean, this is playing out completely in de Sade. Even though they're forming, you know, this is a very different kind of thing. I don't know if you've read de Sade, but, you know, this was a criminal organization with a chateau that was to confront the French Revolution, you know, in some ways outside of, you know, Paris. You know, and he, of course, was put in jail for murdering a prostitute, you know, and wrote a lot of his stuff from jail. But anyway, they see de Sade and Nietzsche as two people that are, you know, totally anti-progress in this.
Return the
Yeah.
regress.
Yes, right. Yeah. And even, yeah, exactly. And you know, so you can maybe look at this in terms of value systems today. You know, Richard, there's a very good, I forgot the author's name, maybe someone knows, a sociology on moral indignation in middle-class psychology. This seems to be a book, I forgot the author's name, but I remember reading it, kind of being floored by the level this guy understood of what middle-class psychology is. And that's America, really. I mean, this is the United States, you know. I mean, yeah. My friend Andrew Long, was with Zizek's first wife, Renata, in the coast, and she says, "What's this with the Me Too?" You know, she's going on about this. You know, she's a sociologist.
Stanley's wife was really down on the middle class.
Hate the middle class morality. Yeah. Big arguments with Andrea Dworkin and Catherine McKinnon on pornography and and pleasure. Yeah. Big arguments on the way with Ellen Willis. Yeah. That part of feminism was about pleasure. It was not really about indignation, about customs and mores and this kind of thing. Yeah.
It wasn't about victimhood.
No, you were the victim. Anyway, they were good at turning around. And Firestone's book, Dialectic of Sex, sees woman as class. That's another thing, too, which is very interesting. Woman becomes a category of class and movement in class. So that's the dialectic of sex. Is really, woman is a class category, not a gendered category. Specifically. The first class, yeah. So it's a very interesting book if you want to read. That was Ellen Willis's best friend, during that. They were the Red Stockings group, yeah. Sheila Firestone, who nobody talks about anymore.
That's a very radical book.
It's very
radical writing. I mean,
devoted to Simone de Beauvoir. Wow. Yeah.
Chastas would bring her name up in discussion.
You do?
Yeah. In our school,
oh,
sure.
Yeah.
Whose name?
Firestone.
Oh, she's weird.
Yeah. Can't take her. I mean, just way out there.
She's crazy.
She was crazy. She was crazy because everybody drove her crazy later. But anyway, yeah, please.
I just sorry to read this question, but I just wanted to come.
Yeah, sure.
144.
134.
144.
24. Okay.
144.
I'm sorry. My apologies. Yeah.
Lecture 14. In the middle, I think this will lead to the parts that Beth wanted to talk about.
Yeah.
140.
So towards the middle, because I wanted to ask the question of progress because I just wonder if Adorno has kind of still have a latent belief in a progress. So
latent what?
Belief in a progress?
Well, so I think you can't live without a little bit of latent belief. I guess, unless,
But I thought his definition was really interesting.
I don't know, yeah.
In the middle, he said, in other words, the path of progress involves a process in which certain human groups find themselves dispossessed. Groups which certainly belong, in terms of their origin and ideology, to the realm of a bourgeois society, but which now suddenly forfeit the material basis of precisely this bourgeois existence to which both their history and their ideology points. And I thought it was just a great line of what we believe in progress, and he begins his unpacking of what is progress is about in the rest of the chapter, or
his Marxism comes out very clearly there.
Yes.
Progress is dispossession.
Yeah.
I like that.
Yeah, boy, that's helpful.
They can use that a lot.
Accumulation by dispossession.
One of the fundamental traumas in Eastern European, contemporary smart Marxism, is that the notion of dispossession of the bourgeoisie, which interrupted the European sort of bourgeois progression towards, more genteel bourgeois society, that's seen as the original sin of the Stalinist revolutions in the East. The dispossession part is a big problem. Why did they have to do that? That interrupted, all these intelligentsia, and so so you can immediately quote Adorno here because he's a Western Marxist.
Yeah, I just want to. I think you've raised a very good point, but on the next page, I think he explicates it even better You know, the task of a dialectical theory, 145, I'm sorry, top of the page. And the task of a dialectical theory of society must always consist in refusing to regard what has not kept pace, what has lagged behind in a simply static fashion, that is, as something which has simply lagged behind, which is now opposed to change and movement. For if the extremes are indeed as reciprocally mediated as I have attempted to make clear to you, then the static and the dynamic dimensions are themselves mediated with one another here. That is to say, the supposedly static sectors of society must actually be derived from the dynamic trajectory at work. I think it will be useful for you to grasp this point clearly, talking to students obviously, and will enable you to form a precise idea between the difference between dialectical and non-dialectical thinking here. A non-dialectical sociology would say something like the following, as Mannheim and others have exactly said, right? So, you know, he's got his antagonists, right? On the one side, there are certain dynamic, mobile, and progressive groups, right? And here's your liberal, you know, ideology at work right here, liberal left, and you know, namely those involved in finance capital and to a certain extent in industry, especially manufacturing industry and the like. And then by contrast, there are static, regressive, and conservative groups, such as the peasantry, people in Alabama, right? And society simply consists in the way the static and dynamic factors then constitute the static and dynamic factors yield a kind of mixture. And the result of these, static and dynamic factors then constitute the history which we have to accept as ours. This conception of Mannheim's is fundamentally superficial and undialectical. For what it fails to grasp, and I think this is very important, is not so much the eminent degree to which the dynamic process of history also bears elements of the past within itself. Everyone will concede that. The Hegelian Aufhebung, you know, the movement of but rather, and above all, the reverse, the fact that the static and persisting aspects are actually functions of dynamic principles.
It is those left behind who define what our society is. We are defined by those that are left behind.
I'll give you a saying.
It's not an accident.
Yeah, right, right. I'll give you a saying of Walter Benjamin's: we must have hope for those without hope. Right. That's sort of, you know, one proposition one could use to, you know, explicate this a little bit. Yeah, yeah.
Almost Christian.
Well, I mean, nobody said, Nietzsche thought that the French Revolution was just a repeat of Christianity. That's the Antichrist and the whole thing historically, if you really read Nietzsche through a historical lens, is that, you know, the drive for equality and you know, what he would consider leveling down and all of these things were, you know.
Well, he hadn't seen Roy Moore, that's why.
No, that's right.
Christianity.
He saw Roy Moore early on in Germany when he was growing up, I'm sure, with the Lutheran father pastor. Yeah. Or maybe he saw Roy Moore's priest. better. Right. Anyway. And this is where the family here, right? I draw your attention to that of the family. The family is indeed a natural form of association. That's Rousseau, by the way. The first, you know, natural form of association is social contract, you know, early on. One that actually contradicts the universal principle of exchange. In other words, the thing which individual family members accomplish for one another within the family cannot simply be expressed in terms of exchange relations. You find this above all in circumstances where, in a certain sense, the family is still involved with the material process of production, namely in the country, where the peasant family still functions as labor power, and where, in fact, to a considerable degree, these very small economic units are able to maintain their life at all only because, from an objective-economic perspective, the labor of the family is undercompensated. Right? It's very easy to say that the family is like an island of irrationality, of merely natural growth, of mere traditionalism within an otherwise thoroughly rationalized world, as if the shape of the family, the feudal past, still somehow reached into our world, as indeed in an emphatic sense there is something feudal about the concept of the family. However, matters stand in this regard. Here too it would be a superficial view of things to believe that the family has persisted simply as a kind of remnant within an otherwise fully developed exchange society. Rather, we must ask ourselves, how is it actually possible that the family should survive at all in spite of a constantly increasing degree of rationalization? For the moment, I would like to ignore the fact, as various sociologists such as Schlefsky and somewhat different emphasis Baumert have shown, that the family itself is currently undergoing a process of restructuring and effectively forfeiting more and more of its natural and, if you like, its pre-capitalist features. But even in the context of these modifications, the family as such still retains a pre-capitalist. It still retains a pre-capitalist in character, or as in its character. The answer to this question, it seems to me, does not really lie in the notion that something like the family possesses a kind of greater resistance in this regard, and indeed one may question whether such a power of resistance is really so great within any individual family. And anyone who knows anything about psychology also knows how problematic the unity of the family is, and just how much material for potential conflict for everyone involved the family invariably brings with it. Rather, in order to understand this archaic and anachronistic character of the family, which has survived within our own society, it seems necessary to bear in mind our society, for all its rationality, itself remains irrational. That is to say, it continues to stand under the law of profit, rather than the one which it prescribes the satisfaction of human needs. And this same irrationality also causes or compels society to maintain certain irrational sectors within itself, for at the point where the bourgeois principle of bourgeois society would be fully realized, would be utterly and completely rationalized, there, bourgeois society, we might almost say, would cease to be a bourgeois society at all, because there would no longer be any place for precisely those moments which provide the motivation of economic activity in the society. Thus, insofar as a progressively rationalized society is still bound to the irrational and arbitrary control of labor of others, it is thereby also necessarily and inevitably dependent upon the survival of irrational institutions of the most various kinds. Thus, while on the one hand these institutions are indeed an anachronism within bourgeois society, they are on the other hand also required by bourgeois society. Right? Good, huh? And we must suspect that the more purely and completely bourgeois society realizes its own principle, the more it will require such irrational institutions as the family, the only one that I have specifically emphasized here. We could also point to others, and in our time much more powerful and influential institutions in this regard. So he's good at this, yeah. And President Putin's got this down. We'll send it to him.
When he says,
who?
In Roman North, when he says America was much better,
yes,
where, families cared for each other, even though there was slavery.
Yes.
Oh my God, where it's all maybe it's been reading Adorno.
Steve Bannon's reading Adorno and translating it for Roy Moore.
There was in the last few days a conference of the so-called alt-right in Maryland.
Where? In Maryland?
Yeah.
What part of Maryland?
Outside D.C., some winery or something.
Okay.
And the line now is they're against capitalism.
Yes.
Their innovation for the new year will be they're going to come out with the anti-capitalist line, and they hope to
alt-right and alt.
Many otherwise leftists.
Well, they might be becoming fascist.
Yeah.
Properly known.
That's Zizek's line.
I told you we should be studying conservative revolution.
The alt-right should join with the alt-left.
Right? Yes. Yeah. And where was this? Wasn't in Chevy Chaser, but not the CIA strongholds, huh? Yeah. I got you. Somebody said state. Oh, it must have been. Maybe it was Montgomery County then.
Someone's hustling.
Yeah. Potomac, maybe. They could go for Potomac.
That's the new line that they're going to come out with a very strong anti-capitalism position.
They're going to attack corporations.
And who's that going to appeal to? Do you think? Let's think this through.
They favor white supremacy in their attacks on capitalism and.
But it's going to really favor these bases in the white working class in the South all throughout. This is building the base even stronger going forward.
Redneck revolt.
Yeah.
Going to steal those issues from under the left.
Yep.
Rednecks against capitalism. That's good.
There
Rycooter can do
is
it.
such a group that provided defense in Charlottesville.
Right.
They're anti-capitalist and and anti-racist, and they call themselves, I think, Redneck Revolt.
Yeah, they do. Yeah.
It's an offshoot of the John Brown Society.
Right.
Redneck Revolt is an offshoot of the John Brown Society? Really?
These are people who have a class analysis.
John Brown for strategic reasons. Depending where you are, one works better or better. Yeah, but they're all part of the same.
Do they subscribe to the proposition that he said at the end, right before he was hanged? This country will be bathed in blood?
Who said that?
John Brown.
Was an incredible terrorist.
Yeah, he was a good terrorist. I like the way you put that. In this group, here we go.
With admiration.
Yeah, right.
I heard the admiration.
Right. So,
against white supremacy, right? I mean,
Yeah.
So, the question of progress is very, very, very difficult, I think, in this way, and I think what Peter said too, when Benjamin says we must have hope for those without hope, is a very Christian notion that comes out of, yeah. And that's always been a problem too. I mean, going forward, how do you separate out, revolutionary practice and, from quote unquote, you only represent the victims, right? Or it's only about the victims, etc. How do you really transform society if it's only going to be about, the meek shall inherit the earth? Right, you can't. Yeah.
There, Liz Marcuse had, he had a principled line.
Yeah.
We can debate in terms of the nuclear bomb or not, but the notion of the great refusal,
Yes.
At least gives you some kind of strategic standpoint from which to try to figure out what can be done under these kinds of conditions where the other side has an immense advantage.
Yeah. The great refusal, by the way, was the practice of negative thinking to its limit. Yeah. You would not partake, and it wasn't like just boycotts and divested, the sanction movement.
Was it a book?
No, chapter in the end of Aryan civilization. Yeah.
That fits very well with the American tradition of Melville and the others.
It does. Yes. No, he understood that. I mean, that Adorno didn't understand that part of the United States, and I don't think he really wished to. Just like the whole thing with progressive jazz or free jazz, he just didn't want to go there. But I mean, you're right. I mean, Marcuse had that real sense of the American 19th century and and he read people here. He read seriously a lot of the people. He was friends with Barrington Moore, the philosopher. They did that critique of repressive tolerance. Another thing about toleration for Marcuse, if there's too much toleration, it can become repressive. That's another thing too. That the great refusal is more, in some ways, against the kind of banal toleration that we have of everything goes or everything is permitted all the time. So he would be very anti-postmodern in that regard, in that way, and somewhat Kantian, I think, the establishment of limits. You would have a limit structure in which you would work from. So, but the Great Refusal, came after he actually wrote Negative Thinking, I think, after the Great Refusal. After the Great Refusal, because the Great Aryan Civilization was 55 and 60. He wrote The Power of Negative Thinking as the new preface to Reason and Revolution. And then Counter-Revolution and Revolt. We've been in 50 years of counter-revolution. That's another thing. we're just reading symptom after symptom after symptom at this point, you know, and yeah. So maybe the Rednecks in Revolt is the name of the group?
Redneck Revolt.
Revolt. Yeah, maybe they'll save us.
That's what Zizek says.
Is Zizek into the Redneck group?
No, he says that the alt-right has to unite with the alt-left in an anti-capitalist nexus.
I'd like to see who makes deposits to his bank account. Anyway.
Did you see that?
I'm very suspicious. No, I'm going to read it. I'll read it. I heard about it. Yeah, I haven't read it. Zizek. The two old left and the old right should get together.
Yeah. It's like when DSA merged with the New American.
Stanley's still getting over that.
He hasn't gotten over it.
He still hasn't gotten over it. It's true. Yeah. Yeah.
It seems like the fundamental problem here is that people like Adorno, maybe unlike Marcuse even, understood revolutionary politics on a very profound level as something that takes, these are epochal changes, and takes profound work, thinking, sort of, you know, the process of negation, the fracturing, right? The fracturing is part of, to me, the fractured dialectic is part of confronting hegemony in thought, right? You fracture it before, I mean, through these negations and the overcomings and all these things. And people like Zizek, you know, it's hard to put Zizek next to Adorno. It's not the right thing to do, but or people like Heidegger understood these things as well. That politics really are these epochal changes, revolutionary politics, whether they're counter-revolutionary or whatever. These are this is serious business. And there's very little humor in Adorno, you know, in this sense. I mean, occasionally we see these jokes and whatever. Just like there's very little humor in Lenin when he talks about revolutionary politics. So I think to me, that's very interesting. Like, when we talk about revolutionary politics, this is a war, you know, like Foucault said. This is politics is the continuation of war through other means. And like when Amy Goodman, I mean, I like Amy Goodman at a certain level or whatever, like David Harvey, all these other people, when they talk about their critique of capitalism, it's still not the mode of delivery.
Well, Amy Goodman doesn't especially have a critique of capitalism.
The mode of delivery,
she has a commitment to,
right,
you know,
is not serious enough.
Yeah,
you know,
yeah,
it's not a question of you know, it's insufficient seriousness. Like with Heidegger, you get that profoundly serious matters. You know, throughout the writing. Adorno, you get that. And, you know, all the people that we read, we get that, right? Yeah. But with some of these other people that we talk about, we definitely get that. We don't get that seriousness. Right. It becomes like a joke or humor or, you know, some kind of a pun. And, like, these are not things that should be punned about, you know?
We're in a class war.
Yeah, this is, like, very serious
stuff. The other
stuff,
side is winning.
Yeah, this is not about joking around and, like Zizek's comments. And, like, this is a very dangerous thing that Zizek does, you know? Or maybe he doesn't get it, you know? So I appreciate Adorno's like seriousness to the matter at hand, you know, like this kind of like careful plotting, like thinking about politics, you know, and to me like that's a good model to follow, you know, like if you're going to be serious about or like Negri says, like you got to live like a communist if you want to be, like you have this visceral kind of hatred and dislike, you know, of the material that you understand and you.
Well, I don't think you can get to this kind of level of thinking unless you have that visceral hatred and that visceral knowledge.
He has the Nazis.
He has it. You have to be humorless. I don't agree with this notion that.
Well, I don't think he's humorless.
I'm not saying humorless, but superficial humor.
It's not as if when Adorno writes about other things, he's very jovial and full of humor. And when he writes about revolution, he becomes very serious. It's always.
No, what I'm saying is, in the American context, we tend to joke around a little bit too much in a superficial way. Everything becomes a meme or some kind of a joke, you know, and like that's why we are where we are. We have this primitive politics, you know, historically speaking, and you know, it's an interesting thing that I noticed with this kind of.
The meme was originally invented by the Situationists as a subversive approach and attack. I think with Adorno, I really think it's temperamental with him. I don't think it's only you know, serious.
You're going to psychologize him now?
What?
I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding.
What?
That's an undialectical thing to do, to psychologize him. I'm playing though.
Well,
I mean, you know, the way he is temperamental.
He never smiles.
Yeah.
No, I mean not he's temperamental. I mean
think
his
that,
seriousness is temperamental. It's not simply
No.
because of the content of
Well,
the
this is a
subject.
person that said there's no poetry after Auschwitz.
Yeah.
Impossible.
But it
You know, this is
also
a very
feel like-
scarred, very deeply hurt, you know, melancholic sort, you know, whose, you know, vehicle is writing this way, who had, you know, an incredible range from music to art, to literature, to philosophy, to, you know, social theory, etc.
His world,
I mean,
like
you know,
the world of like Hegel and Marx,
and this is
perpetrated genocide. I mean, like, you know, his
Yeah.
own world, the
Yeah.
world that he came out of, you know,
Yeah.
his own society that he's going back 10 years later.
Yeah.
It must have been an extraordinarily moving thing to see like the destroyed city and you know, to talk to these friends who were there or the ones who didn't survive. I mean, this is like, you know, it's a very moving kind of work. Like you can see
You feel
know,
that
you feel the
he's writing through the gravity of suffering and the proximity to suffering.
Yeah, agreed. I don't think that makes him humorless, though. I think there's a
really
tremendous
funny
minimum
part
moralia. The aphorisms in minimum moralia are full of humor. I mean, it's his kind of attempt, you know, to, you know.
So like humor versus joking.
Yeah, well, I
you
mean,
know,
it's a different thing. You know, if you read Freud on, you know,
Like
the
Zizek.
jokes and their relationship to the unconscious, you begin to say that the joke always has a serious import, right, in a way. Adorno has this craft in terms of his aphoristic writing in Minimum Moralia to, I think, push, you know, the force to where you have to work in order to get the joke. You know, I mean, in a sense, right? I mean, you know, yeah.
It's not like a
Yeah.
superficial
I
shock
think
value
it's-
kind of a joke,
It's
like
a
Zizek's
state.
statements.
I mean, it's like the icons of it. The saints are always very serious, as you know. They're never smiling or joking.
In Mexico, they smile.
Well,
The Mexican saints
well,
smile.
The saints?
Yeah, in the cathedrals in Mexico.
that's priceless. That's priceless.
There you go, Nori. You got a definition, working definition. It can work.
So I think, you know, we can't mimic that kind of moralistic tendency that one has to be quite serious.
Well, that's not
And
a
so-
question of
It's
morality.
not moralism, man.
Yeah,
It's
not
It's
morality.
not the case that otherwise, you know, the left would be very strong in the United States if not for, you know, a certain lightness and of being, you know, you know, I don't think it has anything to do with the lack of a left in the United States. People being joking about the situation or joking about politics. Nothing has nothing to do with it.
Well, I mean, someone like Bertolt Brecht is full of humor.
Right.
I mean, he's
Humor can be a weapon.
constantly, and he uses humor as a great weapon, you know. And satire has a history of this. I mean, you know, when you read Bakhtin on the history of satire, you know, going back to the Roman satirists, what they did in terms of the beginnings of empire, and all of this. So yeah, I mean, humor has a place. I mean, you know, it's just that this is a melancholy science, to use Gillian Rose's phrase for Adorno. It's the melancholy science, you know, and which was also very serious, you know. And this is another thing too that the left may not undergo, is the melancholy. There's no mourning. You know, in a sense, it's always activism will do it for us. You know, that the working through of the loss of possibilities is not really there, so that you can really learn from it. I think that's one, you know, working, you know, premise. You could, you know, that the lack of mourning. Yeah, in a way.
Organized.
Yeah.
Yes,
that was
of course.
Joe Hill.
Yes, that's right. Well, but unfortunately, it's much more sophisticated techniques of surveillance and policing than the one we had during Joe Hill. I like, you know, of course, that works as a good slogan. Yeah, like workers' cooperatives. Yeah, in a way.
Friend says about the practical nerve.
Yes.
What?
Sorry. Yeah.
Things don't change because people are active.
Yeah.
Not because
Yeah.
they're attached.
Yeah.
Or joking about
I mean,
it.
where's the
They're
next
active.
demonstration?
That's why it doesn't change.
Yeah. I mean, it's going to be Roy Moore next week on Tuesday. Watch the demonstrations. You know, it's going to be next week. It's going to be Israel, Jerusalem, you know, the capital, and it's going to be Roy Moore. That's going to be the demonstrations. That'll be the scene, right? right? I mean, I'm not, listen, I'm not putting down the, you know, I don't really mean it to come across that way. It's just, it is almost a historical, it's a mode of prediction now that we're really in terms of this, and where is the efficacy, and ultimately, you know, what is really being learned here. Like, and you know, this is part of going back to Amy Goodman and her friend Noam Chomsky. I don't think people act once they have the knowledge of something. No. They don't act. And this is the whole premise of Noam Chomsky's politics. Well, if people only knew, you know, they only knew. I can map the Paradise Papers, fill the wall with the trajectories of capital here. That ain't going to change anything once we know, you know, right, in a sense. Yeah, yeah.
It's helpful to know the weak points.
I guess part of our situation now is where are we going to locate the weakest links in the chain, if those chains really in more of a serious vein, you know, in some ways. Right? Yeah. I mean, that's always the question. And it seems to me that people such as, listen, again, these are very minor brains, pea-sized, but they're working, such as Steve Bannon. They're able to identify and use these things to you know, mobilize people. They're able to use this politically in such a way. Not that they're using, you know, Adorno, but yeah. I can remember.
Bad ideas always trump no ideas.
Well, that might be one part of the equation. Yeah, yeah. Sure. But they have more ideas all the time.
Because I doesn't have any ideas.
No, I know.
Trump is the master of the spectacle. We watch and we react.
Well, CNN thought so. That's why he's president. He made millions for them.
Oh, yeah.
You can see him telling them that too.
Yeah.
Or his handlers.
Now they're outraged.
Yes. Well, of course. That helps too. Helps the ratings. Yep. Both sides. See, I did it for you.
Both sides.
Both sides of the, you know, yeah, right. No wonder I own casinos. See? Right, anyway, I'm just, yeah. Not that he's that smart, but yeah, obviously. Yeah. And, you know, we're going to hear about, you know, the Mueller report too, right? You know, we had 58 people that are going to try to impeach him. Right? What was the vote in the House? There was 58 for the going with the impeachment proceedings out of 435. So
well, yeah, if they do, it's still not out.
Yeah, it's still not out if he's impeached. So it's witness Clinton, etc. Right? So what is Mueller going to find? Right? That somehow Deutsche Bank gave the loan that they had to Trump to the Russian VEB bank. Right? This is what we're going to start learning, you know, and that somehow Trump was paying back a loan to the Russians, right? And in this process, somehow he may have whispered, "Oh,
take away the sanctions."
Yeah. We'll take away the sanctions, and the Russians whispered back to him, "We're going to help you get elected." You know, we know how to handle the Clintons because she's going to go to war with us, and we don't want that. That's going to upset the global, you know, balance of power among the ruling oligarchs, or at least our kind of oligarchs.
By buying $150,000 worth of advertisements on.
Yes, exactly. Well, that's another thing. They're good at covering up. Even if it was $20 million worth, it's still ultimately the question really remains: does it really make, you know, a difference, you know, in terms of the political action? I mean, that's sort of the question. I mean, you know, to play, you know, with the Adornian pessimism here, and you know, against.
We're not being pessimistic enough.
No, I know that's probably true. No, I know that. No, I know.
Well, the rich have. They're going to New Zealand.
Well, I don't think.
No, seriously, they've all.
We go to Montreal. It's okay.
That's their.
Rachel likes the nuts in the north.
Or the underground bunkers too.
Yeah. Well, Gates has a big underground place, you know, outside of Seattle.
Really?
They've got a shelter. Yeah, big shelter. Yeah, $100 million they spent.
So they know they're
of course they're all prepared for this. They got private armies to protect them. You know, I mean, you got to realize, put yourself in that subjective position or that subject position. They know the whole world's pissed at them. They know they're moving targets in a certain way. So you know, constantly, you know, they're paranoid.
We're losing the struggle. Now we're winning, and they're afraid.
No, they're not. I mean, they're prepared in case.
Oh, I see.
In case. Yeah. Of course.
It's part of the risk society.
Yeah. In New Orleans, the minute after Katrina, the richest people in the city hire Mossad and Blackwater to protect their properties after Katrina. Yeah. To protect Audubon Place, Audubon Park, Audubon Street, all the wealthy areas off of St. Charles Avenue are protected by Blackwater and Mossad from potential, you know, looting, you know, getting in. And these are areas not hit badly. I mean, you know, minor damage, a tree fell, you know, or something, or a couple of other things. You know, high ground, you know, nicest, quote, you know, residential section of the city. So they go out and they hire extra, you know, not the New Orleans police, which they, you know, own lock, stock, and
Probably
barrel.
cheaper to bring the outside.
I don't know about that, but anyway, yeah. Certainly more efficient.
Yeah, that's part of the calculation.
Yeah. So,
So
anyway.
why aren't we prepared then? They have their escape plan. Where's ours?
We're going to go to Bushwick. We have the base, May Day. We have a bar. We're working on a charter school, a middle school charter school. That's about all we're going to be able to do. And interestingly enough, the L train won't be even running there, so we're going to have, maybe we'll have to rent a helicopter to, you know, get people over there. Yeah. I mean, the thing is, you can't write a novel like this. You know, it used to be you have novels were interesting. The fiction was much, you know, more imaginative. But the reality now is much more imaginative. You know, who can write this novel? Yeah.
The dreams do not dream.
Yeah. Child predator becomes senator, right? I mean, really, this is 2007. I mean, it's so disgustingly, you know, but it's so absurd. I mean, you talk about a joke and a serious joke. I mean, you know, going forward, right?
I thought all the bourgeoisie was perverse.
Yeah. And the working class doesn't drink Budweiser, right?
It's cheap.
Yeah, I know. I'm aware of that. Yeah. So, what I mean, I think maybe you know, more serious.
They're trying to bring back Fear of the Atomic Bomb again. And, you know,
we can listen to Charlie Mingus on that one. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's a good one. Yeah, Mingus did a great piece on the atomic bomb. 1962. He did a great orchestra piece about the atomic bomb. Don't let those chickens out. You know, he's got a lot of scouting and stuff. Then you can Atomic Cafe on the beach. You know, great films. Yeah.
Yeah, no, Harper says the whole issue. He talked about
Right.
everybody should be afraid.
What are they pushing? What is there? Just that we should be afraid?
Yeah, we should be afraid. Maybe we should build fallout shelters again.
Who said this?
This is in Harper's.
Oh, Harper's Magazine. Yeah,
Yeah.
right. Well, people are running out of things to write about too,
That's true.
because the reality is moving so fast, way ahead of what. Yeah.
You need hot takes. The word of this year,
Yeah.
they're going to pick the word. You know what it is?
Hot take?
Breaking. Breaking news. Breaking.
Really?
Oh, the breaking. Yeah. Okay.
Breaking.
Breaking news alerts. Yeah. Glued to the iPhones.
Everything is breaking.
Well,
The break is some new accusation of
Yes.
Yeah.
conduct.
Donald Trump says blah blah.
So, Michael, I think next semester should be a class on fantasy.
That's not bad. How about fantasy and phantasms? since we're living through, you know, probably a period of great, you know, broken hegemonies of which phantasms continue to reappear, and we're almost constituted by these elements of the phantasms as we speak today about everything from progress to the bringing back of Harper's Magazine of the atomic bomb, or we're talking about the family, such an archaic concept, but anyway, you know, in some ways, yeah. So.
And North Korea's gonna nuke us, baby.
Yeah.
Yeah. The pick the right city.
Well, New York City's the first target. They said it already.
He did say that?
Yeah.
Oh, I thought he liked New York.
New York and Chicago and Washington.
Probably too many Koreans.
Who said?
Oh,
North
maybe he wants. Yeah, he doesn't like the South Korean 32nd Street.
So New York City's the
Now I
first
understand. I understand the target. Yeah. 32nd Street. Yeah.
Don't hit my bibimbap.
Yeah.
Yes, that's right.
Why wouldn't they go for Washington?
No, they're gonna hit both.
Huh?
They have more missiles than, you know. They're gonna hit both. They said the first two targets are New York and Washington. I mean, I don't know what they're thinking, but that's the targets. The new missile can reach New York. It's 15,000 kilometer range missile, so it's guaranteed.
Then I'd rather be on ground zero.
Yeah, I'm with you.
That's why Trump has stopped talking about Korea in a certain way, because they told him the military did
This
analysis.
week, he's concentrating on getting more elected.
The military did analysis. There was a congressional testimony, and they said we can't stop the missiles. That's it.
Is there anything in the Bible about the capital of?
Right.
See, that's what I'm talking about. The jokes, you know. Like, there could be a nuclear war. And
Clever today. Clever dialectician, our friend. Yeah, very clever.
So you got to be on point.
I like this full circle. Yeah. Maybe we can kind of end with. I think he has a very good thing at the end of lecture 15, and you know, maybe what we can do too is maybe put out some pointers on this, since we, you know, really haven't worked through text to you know, outward, you know, for next week. Put out some pointers. But anyway. I like 160. Chris, this is in lecture 15, the second full to last paragraph, about halfway into it. Page 160. 160, and it's about 10 lines from the bottom. The sentence begins with, but today the concept of intellectual control has largely, I will not say absolutely, but largely reversed its original function. For today, it effectively amounts to preventing a nonconformist form of thought. Thought, which cannot simply be translated into a step-by-step approach to knowledge, namely into development of what is already given, a form of thought which cannot just be reproduced by anyone whatsoever and at a time whatsoever. The principle of the gradual acquisition of knowledge basically amounts to the idea that we can only ever think what is already known with constant variations, as it were in a process of infinitesimal transition to the new. And this idea negates those fractures in truth and knowledge which are rooted in the fractures of the world itself, and which furnish the content of genuine knowledge as such. In view of the danger, I seem to be contradicting certain democratic rules of the game where knowledge is concerned. I should perhaps say here that even in the Universitas Literatum, in the Republic of the Learned, the notion that everyone must check every thought, at least in its own professional field, that the truth or dignity of an intellectual achievement must be judged in each case by the number of positive recommendations that have been garnered from professional colleagues, strikes me as extraordinarily problematic. There you go, Peter and Arto. For the consciousness to which we actually appeal here as the criterion of truth is for its part a consciousness that has already been shaped by the mechanisms of the social accommodation, and one which tends in many cases to excise what is actually essential to thought. Very good, yeah. But of course, there's also no guarantee that a nonconformist thought, this is interesting, is necessarily true. For precisely through the kind of intellectual control which has now become universal, Everything which escapes it tends in turn to assume apocryphal or rather far-fetched character, and indeed, in extreme cases, such as that of the originally highly gifted, right, and recently deceased psychoanalyst Wilhelm Reich. It's humor, right? may ultimately come to appear paranoid or even fraudulent. In our current situation, we are actually confronted with a very grave antinomy. On the one hand, thought is consumed in the blind repetition of what exists and is known anyway, namely in conformity. And on the other hand, thought which eludes methodical control thereby runs the danger of being uncontrollable in any sense and effectively falling into delusion. And this tendency is surely not the least innocuous of those symptoms of intellectual disassociation and collective schizophrenia, which we can observe today in so many areas of life. This is 58, right? And one that deserves, it seems to me, to be taken with extraordinary seriousness. The truly new, by contrast, is thus always a qualitative leap, to use Hegel's language. A qualitative leap not in the sense of a kind of thought which leaps anywhere, but in the sense of a leap which is produced by persistent exposure to the object itself. And, expressed in these terms, this approach stands in inevitable contrast, in extreme contrast to the adoption of some quite new or quite different standpoint. When I spoke earlier about the mobility of thought, and if you like, defended this mobility, I should perhaps add, in order to protect this especially vulnerable thought from misunderstanding, that mobility of thought here does not mean a constant readiness to change what is generally described as a standpoint. Rather, it refers to a self-reflective change in the approach of thought, depending on whether it has to relate to the context in which the particular stands or to the particular itself. But the essence of philosophy, and I believe that the important philosophers, specifically since Hegel, are actually all agreed on this, seems to lie precisely in the repudiation of anything like the concept of a standpoint. Although this is exactly what defines the popular notion of philosophy as a kind of worldview. Here's your Heidegger, by the way, from 1920s. Thus, in place of some such externally introduced standpoint, what is involved here is actually the compelling movement of the matter itself, or something which is also captured in the Cartesian doctrine of a gradual advance from one point to the other. If you read this, he basically went through the steps of Descartes' method, right? The movement of, self-evidence to part to whole, breaking down the, the problem into as many parts as possible, the order moving from the simple to the more complex and the order of reasons, and then the process of enumerating everything so nothing is left out, and the step-by-step procedure, right? From one point to another. The movement of thought, the dynamic movement of thought, moment of thought, is also contained in that Cartesian axiom which we criticized earlier. So in a way, the Cartesian moment is very much part of dialectical movement, right? Very much part. It's not something that you just push aside or throw out, It may yield a kind of positivism. It may yield a foundation for the natural sciences that we can certainly critique, in various forms, but it's still a part of the movement of thought. If I omitted any reference to this positive aspect, it's because I regard this as almost self-evident. Descartes himself also knew, of course, that knowledge is essentially a process rather than a merely immediate kind of recognition, right? And this is what digitalization is doing. It's just making everybody into, recognizing subjects, right? You recognize very simple system of references and signs that are going on here, and processes being, taken away. This is one reason I think that the new right and the old right is so successful, and this whole, mediatic culture is so successful. This mediatic hegemony. We've forgotten about process. We don't really deal with process anymore. It's all about recognition. I know that. That's my recognition, in this. Aspect. We become very simplistic, correspondence theory of truth. Everything is, in this one-to-one relationship. very simple referential systems, you know, etc. But anyway, all right, the knowledge is than merely immediate kind of recognition. It is just that he could only grasp the movement of thought which he saw in, you know, the 17th century and articulated. And this is precisely the bourgeois aspect. You know, remember Descartes, and if you want to read a good political book on Descartes, Tony Negre's early work, Political Descartes, is worth reading, where he situates Descartes within the age of manufacturing capital, you know, and talks about why the drive for certainty in method during that period. Very, very solid work, very early work of Antonio Negre. Yeah, is in the image of what is static and rigid, and the symbol of the latter, which appears in this connection, which was also mocked by de Maistre, is itself the sign that even what is dynamic appears only in congealed form here. This dynamic itself appears as if it were thing-like and immobile, as a freezing of movement into something static, to go back to what we read earlier, right? And this has somehow always been inscribed in philosophy in the most remarkable fashion, even in its most dynamic representatives from Heraclitus through to Hegel. And if there's one decisive sense in which dialectical thought must move beyond Hegel himself, then it's surely at this very point I have described here. Okay? So he's going to, you know, try to go beyond in the last 5 lectures. So, yeah.
So this is the last week of the class, right?
No, he wants to do one next week. He called me again after he said he's not coming. He said, you know, you should have another class. Are you going to be there next? I said, yeah, sure. Yeah, here. We'll do it here. Yeah. Unless you want to go to his place, I don't know. That's up to the group.
But it's convenient for me.
We have enough space.
Convenient here. Yeah, it is enough space, but I think it's better here. Yeah.
It would be nice if they provided heat. Does that go along with the rent?
We're going to subtract from the rent.
If you want to come with me when I take 40% off the check today and complain, you're more than welcome to hear me rant and rave in her thing. I'm not paying the full amount.
No, they should provide heat.
No, it's just ridiculous. Ridiculous. Yeah, no, ridiculous. And it's the feet, too. Yeah.
Are we going to just deal with these chapters again?
I think it would probably be good if you could read as much as you could of 15 through 20. We'll see what, you know, Stanley's got in store. What I'll do is maybe just highlight some of the things from 10 to 15. You know, I'll go home and read that, and I'll send out, you know, some of the things we may have, you know, not only glossed over but completely omitted, you know, in today's discussion, and then we'll go on to 15 through 20 and try to think about, because I know his underlying thesis here, what he wants to show is that Adorno is doing both the dialectics of nature and the dialectics of the social, and this separates him from, you know, Lukács. This is Stanley's working hypothesis here, and that separates him from Lukács, who is only dealing with the dialectic of the social dialectic, for lack of a better term. So he sees in Adorno here, and maybe he can talk about that next week, you know, where is this dialectics of nature in Adorno, and, you know, how does he synthesize or attempt to bring both together in what he calls this dialectical process, that we need to go beyond Hegel. So maybe this is a good working question, since this has been the, you know, the hypothesis that, you know, he began with early in the class. Yeah. So I don't know. Yeah. And we could talk more about. I find sometimes when he's, you know, he talks about, this is 60 years ago. It's very apt for today. I mean, it reads really like we're right in the moment, right? I mean, you know, it goes to show you that temporality is not so much about, you know, series of now points and continuums. All the, you know, that we have very much of a very accurate description, if you will, and analytical categories to work with. Yeah.
Well, the 1950s in some ways has certain resemblance.
Yeah. One philosopher said the 30s are before us, and others have said that we haven't gotten beyond the 50s. So maybe that's true in some senses. Yeah. So.
It's very
I agree with you, Peter. I hear you. Yeah. It's the will speaking. It's my will speaking, not my intellect. It's my will speaking, not my intellect.